What's up? Welcome back to another video here on Free Will Photos. Today we are going back inside of the editor's mind. And what we're going to do is take a photo from really something that is very nice and simple to something that's a little bit more moody, or some would say a low-key black and white edit. And I think black and white photos really do lend itself well to this style. So let's go ahead and jump into ON1 Photo Raw and take a look at how we went from this to this. All right, so here we are inside of ON1, and you can see the final image here. Let me go ahead and show you kind of where we came from. So this is the final effect with a blur around the side. So when I turn this one off, you'll see that we get a little bit more definition and detail around the outside here. And I'll talk you through that when we get to that point. Then I also have a version where it's just this background glow effect. You know, you could take it or leave it. You may or may not like that, but this is the basic low key. All three of these versions are actually really good, and you can use inside of so many different applications of, delivering to a client. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we got here. So this is the base image, and you can see I didn't actually do anything to the base image. This is a image that I downloaded from Unsplash, and I said, this has great lighting already. I wasn't a fan of the color scheme that was going on here, which is why I got the idea to do a low-key black and white portrait. This is just a way for you to really learn what you can do inside of ON1 Photo Raw, and that's kind of why I did this particular edit. Now, I want you to take note of the type of background that the subject is on. It's a very simple background. It's not a complicated or, a very busy background, meaning there's really nothing back there except for some color. There's little to no texture. And that is the type of background that I would recommend you look for when you are editing photos like this, because it just makes it easier for the very first step, which is to cut out the subject. So if I go ahead and turn on this layer up here that I did not rename, you can see I cut out the subject. And I didn't cut the subject out perfectly. I actually just used the subject tool, or the people tool. So if I click on the mask here and I hover over the mask, you can see that for the region, I selected people. That's what selected the individual here. And then I just did a little bit of refining with the chisel tool to kind of pull in that mask. And that's the reason why his ear is cut off a little bit over here. Now, I could have gone in and cleaned that up. The reason why I did that is because originally I was getting a halo, and I can't actually demonstrate that, but essentially on the background here, I was getting a halo around the back of his head, and it just wasn't working for me. So that's why I use a chisel tool to cut more into the subject, so that way that halo would be removed overall. There's other ways of getting rid of it, but I just decided to do it that way because it was faster. Now, I'll show you this background. This is the background with the glow effect. But what I did after I cut the subject out, because there's no background, I just came over here, grabbed a paint bucket, and you can just, however you choose to, you can make this black. And then I put a black layer right underneath the subject layer. And that's how I got the first look, essentially. Obviously, I have some effects on, so let's go ahead and turn those off. Then we'll kind of just build it back up. So this is where I was when I started doing the edit. I had the black background, subject cut out, but the subject was still in color. So the very first thing I did was I applied a black and white filter. Now, the black and white filter is something, you could do however you want inside of here, but I didn't spend a lot of time in the tone adjustments with the black and white filter because I felt that I would have more control using the develop module, which allowed me to use some of the mid-tone adjustments and things that I really enjoy using when modifying the black and white look overall. Now, unfortunately, I can't actually show you the before and after of what this would have looked like with the black and white adjustment, but I'm sorry, with the tonal adjustments here. but that's really kind of irrelevant for this overall effect because based off of the lighting that you're using in your image, you're going to have way different sliders over here. But the goal is to make the subject kind of look darker and blend in with the dark background. That's all that I was really trying to accomplish with the develop option over here. Next, we have some local adjustments. Now, I probably should have renamed these, but I was kind of just moving, and I guess I only put one adjustment here. I have more effects, but only put one adjustment here. So if I turn this off and turn it back on, you can see all I was doing is adding in a little bit more detail over the hair features that were getting kind of washed out in the background. So if you turn this off and on, you can see exactly what that's doing. And I think that that worked out really well. So not much to speak on here. I just added some shadow and some structure, but your image, you'll have to decide if you need that or not. That was just something I felt I was losing some details in the hair features. So I wanted to go ahead and add that. Now here's where all the work really began. So besides the black and white filter, which we'll go ahead and collapse, the next thing that I added was a grunge filter. My goal here was to gain some like clarity, detail, and make the image look a little bit more three-dimensional and gritty and make it pop, right? So that's why I went with the grunge filter. It works really, really well on black and white images. And since this was going to be a primarily darker looking image with like highlights that are really kind of shining through to expose the subject here, that's why I went with this option. Now, I did pull the grunge filter down as far as the amount, but again, this is something you have to think through for your own photos because you may not need even 29 amount of the grunge filter. Then, of course, I've added in some detail. The grunge filter has a detail slider. That's the other reason why I reach for the grunge filter, because I like to add details in my low-key portraits like this. And then I didn't add in any film grain, so nothing to see there. If I hit the letter O, and that's not the right mask, so let's click on this. And now I hit the letter O, there's the mask. So you can see all I did was I painted this in with a brush and I used 100% feather for the edge and just put it where I wanted it. That's all that was. So the next thing we did was, or what I did was I added in a curves adjustment. And this curve, if I turn this off and turn back on, it's actually a little subtle. I think it'll come through on YouTube just because of the luminance value. But if you look at the left, or I guess it's his left cheek, but camera right, the cheek that I'm hovering over right here with the mouse, and then this little specular highlight or shiny spot up here, I was really just trying to match to this side, right? With faces, when you are shaping or sculpting light, you kind of want to make it symmetrical as much as you can, unless of course you're going for a different effect. But the goal is to make the lighting look as symmetrical as you can, especially when you have like sides of the face. Now, if this cheek was more in the background or into the shadow, I wouldn't actually try to expose this a little bit more. I would probably make it a little bit darker. Now, this is a personal technique. This is what I was going for on this image. I don't always do that, but in this image, at least from what I'm understanding, looking at how the light was falling off in this image, is there was some sort of key light, maybe a fill light, but it looks really strong coming from the camera right. And then there was a kick light that was trying to cut the subject out from the background. So keeping that in mind, knowing that I didn't shoot this image, I had to kind of look at where the light was coming from. And that's actually why editing someone else's photo is always a good thing to do, because you get to examine the light without having any of the knowledge of where the light was actually coming from. And this helps you see photos a little bit better as you start editing your own images or creating your own images. So, but as you know, as far as I could tell, there was some form of light coming in from the right side here. Since it's softer, I'm thinking this is the fill side over here. And then we had a key light that was kind of Rembrandt style, but it was also a little bit of a kicker coming from the left side here. And if I'm looking in his eye here, let me zoom in. And this is a good way to tell what was happening with lights in portraits specifically. You look for the catch light. Because our eyes reflect the brightest things that we're looking into, you can see kind of what's happening. And I can tell that there's a light source that's happening on the right side because the light reflection in his eyes are equal on both eyes, and they're on the right side of his pupil as we're looking into the camera or into the photo. So that tells me the light is on the camera right, or the right side of the camera. All right, so let's go ahead and zoom out here. Just wanted to share that trick there because I think that will be very helpful, especially if you're editing someone else's images and you're like, what is going on with the light? Now, this works best with studio lights, but sometimes you can see where a catch light is in outdoor photography, and sometimes if they're using a reflector in natural light photography. So that's essentially what I did here. I just, getting back to the edit now, what I wanted to do was increase the highlight areas on that cheek and the specular highlight up here, since this was what I'm calling the fill side. And all I did was boost the mids in the curve. And then I pulled the opacity down so that way it wasn't so aggressive of a adjustment. And that's all that I did there. Then I went and added in a tone curve. Now, the tone curve is what's giving, I like to call this like the Steve Jobs look. I don't know if this really is, but whatever. There were some black and white photos, a very famous black and white photo of Steve Jobs. And I feel like he had that kind of posture in his photo. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and give him the kind of the Steve Jobs look in my mind, at least. And that's just a stylized thought process. You may not even think like that, and that's okay. But all I did here was with the tone and boost the exposure of the overall area right in his face, because I did mask this in. Let me click on here to activate it, hit the letter O, and I used a gradient filter. So let me show you what that looks like. It's not very large overall. It's just big enough to cover his face. And then by the time that it gets to the outside of his face, it fades off into none of the effect actually applying. So that way the light that I'm sculpting here isn't actually getting impacted on the outside of this area. And that's the power of using a mask overall, is you get to control where the light goes. But you can see I have some exposure going on here, getting a little bit more edginess because I think that fits well. And then I really did exaggerate the whites and the blacks to add more contrast in the face, but giving him a little bit of complement there as well. And then there was a detail slider inside of the tone enhancer. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and give this a little bit more detail in here. And there you have the detail slider. Next, I added another tone enhancer, but this one was the inverse effect. So if I hit the letter O, and that's not the right one, let me activate the mask. There's the right one. And it looks really weird when you look at it like this, but essentially I cut a little hole straight down the middle and said, don't darken that area. And if I hit the letter M, you can kind of see what the mask looks like, or at least the radial gradient. And what I did was I said, I don't want any of the light straight down the center to be impacted. And then I want it to fade off, gradually going to black. And then everything outside of here, I want that to be black or lower exposed. And then I just pull down the opacity. So if I pull up the opacity, you can see how dramatic that gets. And you could, maybe this looks good for your image. You could do so much. But I said, I still kind of want more details in the image. I don't want him to look like he's just sitting in a shadow. But, there's so many things that I could do here. And I restrained myself because how do you know when an edit is actually done? That's always a hard thing when you have a complete creative license. And so what I said was, you know, I want some details left in the image. And so I just pulled down the opacity, and looking at it now, maybe 53 looks really well for a low key approach, and still keeping the face as the primary focus point. I think that that looks really well. So we'll leave it like so. And then what I said was, I want to add in a little bit of a blur. Now, this blur is specifically to take away a little bit of the definition on the outside of the cutout of the individual, because all of these adjustments that I was just showing you, you can see I still have all of those adjustments just on that layer. And if I turn off this blur, I want you to kind of look right around in this area. And if I turn it off and turn it on, you can see all it's doing is softening those areas where I want some detail in there, just so you can see that, you know, there is some texture in the sweater, you know, because if I were to pull this up all the way, it just gets really fuzzy, and that's not a good look. But if I pull it down just a little bit and soften those areas, it just helps with selling the overall effect, I think. And then it blends well. That's all that I was trying to do there. And also do the same thing into his ears and the edges of the overall edit. So this is what the mask for that blur looks like. Now, let's go ahead and turn our background back on, and there it is. So this is essentially the first look, right? This is the first look that I created. If I turn that off or turn that on, and you can see, obviously, as I was pulling some of the sliders, the lighting adjusted a little bit differently, but it's not overly drastic. This one is a little bit brighter. And while I was talking you through it, I made it a little bit darker and moody, but both look good, right? I could live with both effects. And then the next thing that I did was I said, you know, I kind of want a halo back here. Since I already have the subject cut out, this is actually really easy to do. All you got to do is going to your color fill layer. You want to select that, and then you can come over to the local adjustments tab, and down here, let's go ahead and scroll down. We do want to look at the opacity, because the opacity does matter, but we want to come all the way down to the bottom. And let me just minimize the tone here, so that way it's easier to see this. And then I want to click on paint with color. All right. We'll just minimize some of that stuff, because that stuff is irrelevant for what we're doing with this. But I'll click on paint with color using a solid paint. I selected white because this is a black and white image, but I could have made this any color I wanted to. In fact, I could change it after the fact as well. All right. So I could do whatever I want to do with this color, but I want it to be white. So on the Mac, I just selected the swatches, clicked on white to make sure that I had 255 white, and I pulled down the opacity. So that way it's like a little bit of a glow behind the subject. And that is what this version of the image is up here. So that's what I ended with originally. And then I said, you know what? I want to put a blur around the shoulders, because you can see the texture in the sweater. And maybe that's not a huge issue. But then I was like, you know what? I want to blur that. So I just went ahead and added in that blur that I showed you earlier. So in all of those steps, I was able to go from something that looks like this to something that looks like this using ON1 Photo Raw and, you know, all of the various tools. The goal here is to learn how to use the software so you can get the look that you're going after. I did have an idea in mind that I wanted a low-key portrait, and this portrait was just the one that inspired me. Now, your images may do something different, but it's something that you should take into consideration for doing with your photos as you start to sit down and say, what can I do in the editing process? I do want you to remember that the background does make a huge difference, at least in the simplicity of cutting out the subject. Now, if you have a more busy background, there are ways of cutting out the subject. You could do it manually with a brush. You could also use the Super Select AI. There are some tools available inside of ON1 that will allow you to cut out the subject from the background. and then put that black background behind your subject. So with all that said, hopefully you found some value in the content. If you did, smash the like button. If you want to pick up ON1 Photo Raw or anything over at the ON1 store and save a little bit of money, consider using my coupon code FreeWillPhotos20. You'll save some money when you check out. I make a small commission from everyone who uses that coupon code, and I greatly appreciate it. Until next time, I want you guys to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.